film a video? What's up you guys, and welcome back to my channel. So for those of you who are new here or who have not been following along in my channel recently, I picked up a Fujifilm X-Pro2 back in January of 2021. So I've owned the camera for about 2 months now, and I've been doing a ton of content on the camera as well as the lenses that I ended up picking up. But I guess the next natural progression for an X-Pro2 user is getting into shooting vintage lenses. And this is something that I wanted to make this video on because I was getting a little bit bored here at home. The weather has been getting colder again. We had a few really nice warm days, and I was just figuring out what I wanted to do next with the camera to just see what it could do. And so a natural progression was just to get into throwing an adapter on there with a few vintage lenses. And so I went on Amazon and I ordered an adapter to adapt my OM-Mount lenses that I own 2 of already for shooting film to my Fuji X-Pro2. So it's a OM to X mount or XF mount, and you can see this is my vintage lens on here. I wanted to make a little bit of an intro video today to talk about how I set the camera up to shoot with the vintage lens, and simply just why. Like, what's the point of it? What are some benefits? Especially as someone who already does own my kind of ideal Fujifilm lens setup, why throw a vintage lens on here? And this is actually something that came up because I was super excited when I threw this on my camera and started shooting some photos, and I kind of ran up to my boyfriend and I was like, let me explain this really cool thing that I'm doing. And I tried to explain the concept of the fact that I threw on a vintage lens from my film camera onto this digital camera, and he basically responded, what's the point? So while I had not come up with this list of reasons for him on the spot, it allowed me to kind of reflect on why. So I've got 4 that I thought of right off the bat. The first is it's cost effective. Now this is something that is great for someone who maybe wants to try out a new focal length that they don't already own a electronically connected lens for. I've been eyeing the 27mm pancake lens that Fuji has, I believe at this point, just come out with, but for a while it was on pre-order, and it really would have allowed me to elevate my X-Pro2 from an X-Pro2 with this bigger, bulkier, although wonderful 35mm f2 lens to something that would be kind of like having a camera in the X100 series. The one thing that I am a little bit nervous about is that focal length. I love the 37mm focal length, which is in a full frame equivalent of around 50mm. So going from that to something that would be closer to around a 40mm effective focal length, I was a little bit unsure of. Now that being said, that lens is brand new, retailing for I think about $400, and that's a pretty big investment for a lens with a focal length that I'm not sure about. One thing that I actually did realize, which ended up being really good in my favor, is that I own a 28mm vintage lens, and this allows me to have a lens that I already own, so it cost me $0, or if I didn't already own it, it would cost me $50 because that's how much I bought it for on eBay, to purchase a lens of this focal length and test it out and see how I like using that focal length on my X-Pro2. So it's definitely a cost-effective way. Obviously, with the difference in cost, you're giving up features. So the next is the workflow, and this is something that I've talked about in my why I even got my X-Pro2 video, and that is simply that resemblance to shooting film. And one of the things that I really loved about shooting film and X-Pro2 is having all of my adjustments and dials right on the body of the camera. So I have my ISO control on the body of the camera, I have the shutter speed control here, as well as with Fuji XF lenses, I had the aperture ring. With a vintage lens on here, not only do I have all of those things that I get from the X-Pro2, but now I get the feeling of doing manual focus. Now, before everyone comes for me, I know you can also do manual focus on newer lenses as well. And not only are you now forced to do the manual focus, but if you're comfortable and very familiar with the way a vintage lens feels when using it on a film camera, this I've noticed, I like register that when I'm shooting with this, when I'm focusing with the focus ring on my Olympus lens. So that's something that I thought was really cool. It's not going to be applicable to everyone. To each of these kind of reasons why you would shoot on vintage glass, there is a reason why you wouldn't, or why it's actually a pointless reason. And I get that. I'm a realistic person, or at least I would like to think I'm pretty rational. So I totally understand, but it's just something that is going to be different for each photographer, and sometimes you'll find a lot of benefit to something that maybe you didn't realize before. So the next is vintage glass. I love vintage glass, and not to say that newer lenses are not good or that they are worse by any means, because really they are not, but there's something about vintage glass that is so nice, and I love my Olympus lenses. They have produced incredible results for me on film. I've just heard good things across the board in terms of vintage glass. And so the fourth reason is actually the aperture values. So one thing that I've noticed is that with a lot of vintage lenses, you actually are able to get lower f-stop values for cheaper prices. Now, I believe with some adapters, there's some more technical adjustments that happen due to this. So whether or not you actually get like a 1.8, if your aperture ring is set to 1.8, I'm not 100% sure, but that is something to consider and look into if that's something that you would find a benefit, is simply being able to potentially be able to stop wide open to that when you don't necessarily have that access on newer lenses, or having like an f1.4 Fuji lens is so much more expensive. Those are some reasons why I would be pulled to shoot with vintage lenses. I think in general it's just a cool concept of being able to throw your vintage lens and have this like very film style workflow on a digital camera and get the benefits of shooting digital. So the next thing I want to talk about is things to know before you start doing it, how to set up the camera to shoot with a vintage lens, and just some of the things that I learned while setting my X-Pro2 up to shoot with my Olympus lens. So the first thing obviously you're going to need is an adapter. Now, if you're looking at inexpensive adapters, which again, I'm only going to speak from my experience, most likely the adapter is going to have no electronic connections to the camera. That simply means it's going to be there just so that the lens can stay on the body itself. So the next is to set up the shoot without lens mode. Now, because there's no electronic connection from the lens to the camera, your camera is not going to detect a lens on your camera, and because of that, you're going to have to allow your Fujifilm camera to shoot without a lens. So the next is focusing. When it comes to focusing, this is pretty difficult if you're not used to manual focusing or zone focusing. So what I personally like to use when it comes to digital cameras is focus peaking. That's a very commonly chosen option in terms of digital manual focusing. There are other options that Fujifilm offers as well. I forget the name of it, but one of the options is actually very similar to what it kind of feels like to focus an SLR camera. But focus peaking is a really great way to start. I simply select red and it will show a red outline on whatever is in focus. So another thing is to use the electronic viewfinder to help meter. I, at the time of filming this video, have not tried using the OVF or optical viewfinder to shoot in general, and especially on the X-Pro2 with a vintage lens on it. The EVF or electronic viewfinder will actually be able to help you meter if you are using a vintage lens, and by metering I'm talking about exposure. So you can actually see as you change various settings, even with the aperture ring on the lens itself, without any electronic connections to the camera, the aperture plates will physically shrink and expand as you change the aperture on the lens, so you can still see in the electronic viewfinder how over or underexposed you are. And that kind of goes into my next point, is that you can still shoot, at least to my knowledge and what I've done so far, how you would normally shoot elsewhere. I think you would still have to set minimum aperture simply because you have to manually control that on the lens, but I personally usually shoot in aperture priority mode, so I set the aperture in the ISO and my camera will automatically choose my shutter speed for me. So next is setting your focal length in your settings. So I think the only thing that this actually affects is the metadata of the image once it's taken, but you have to go into your menus to set the focal length of the lens that you are using. Again, since your camera thinks it's shooting without a lens, it won't take any details from the lens itself of what its focal length is, so you have to tell the camera itself. And then the last thing I wanted to point out, and I don't know if this is completely unique to me, but first I would like to thank Pasha, who is one of my subscribers / Instagram followers, for helping me with this. I reached out to him to get some further explanation on if I was simply just doing something wrong, but originally I didn't have my lens in all the way on the adapter itself, so there's a pin that the adapter actually pushes in for you on the lens, and that will adjust the actual aperture blades. So on my Olympus OM-10 film camera, where I would normally have this lens on, when I press the shutter button, that's when the pin gets pressed and the aperture blades will adjust according to what I set them to. However, when shooting the X-Pro2 with a vintage lens, you obviously want that adjustment to be made as you're changing the aperture, or the camera won't know how to expose properly if you're using some kind of automatic mode. What happened with me was I didn't screw my lens all the way into the adapter because there was so much friction. I thought it was in all the way, so the pin didn't actually get pressed, and so the aperture was never changing. Even if I was changing it on the lens itself, the blades weren't adjusting accordingly. I have no idea if any of this makes sense. Basically, make sure it's screwed in all the way, or else your aperture blades will not change according to you changing the aperture value. That's all I've got. So, and I'm really excited to see where this takes me. I don't see myself using this that often, simply because I've used fully manual lenses in the past on digital cameras, and to be honest, it's cool, it's a cool experience, and like I said, it's very cost effective, but it's not always realistic because a lot of times I do shoot moving objects, or I shoot like literally on the go in the car, so I rely on autofocus. If you're gonna set it automatically at infinity, it probably would work pretty quickly, but I don't typically shoot like that all the time, especially if I'm shooting like my dog or portraits or anything like that. Regardless, I think the image quality is still phenomenal. The X-Pro2 has really great image quality, on top of the fact that my Olympus lenses, both vintage and current, have amazing image quality as well, so that's not something I am concerned about, or probably will be concerned about. But there will definitely be future videos of me going out and shooting with this setup. I am really excited to see what kind of images I can get out of it. If you guys have any tips on shooting with vintage lenses, or things that you really liked or have learned, please be sure to comment them down below. I really appreciate you guys. Thank you for watching this video and continuing to support my channel. I've built such a great community on my channel, certainly for me, so again, I really appreciate it. I encourage people to respond to others' comments. I know people have been passing some information around, which is kind of amazing to see. So again, I really appreciate that. And if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to subscribe to my channel and stay tuned for my next video. I will see you guys next time.